leper, a judge, and pride. With this story here, we are taught about gratitude, persistence, and humility. Briefly, let's get an overview about exactly where Jesus is at here. He has come down from the Mount of Transfiguration, spent some time in Galilee, goes down the western side of Galilee, and looks like he's going to make his way down to Jerusalem by going through Samaria. But when he gets to Samaria, the cities there are cool towards him. That Jesus had his face towards Jerusalem, and they did not accept him in. The disciples want to call down fire and destroy him, and Jesus had to assure him that he came to save souls, not to destroy them. He then turns and goes straight east. He goes over the Jordan River, more than likely goes down the eastern side of the Jordan, down to an area called Perea. It's also called the other side of Jordan. Perea was ruled by Herod, the same one that ruled over Galilee, the one that killed John the Baptist. But the important thing is Jesus is not in Judah. He's safer in Perea. From there, he will make several trips up to Jerusalem and come back until finally he makes that final trip going up the mountain to Jerusalem. When we come to the lepers here, 10 of them, at least one of them was Samaritan. It could be that all 10 were. It's interesting that Jesus says, go to the priest. Now that's something that was to be done if you were healed from leprosy. Basically, Jesus was saying, you go, and before you get there, you will be healed. They believe him and go. Now, I find it interesting that law was made in the days of Moses. God had that law put in place. I don't think it was used very much until Jesus came along. I think that law was made for when Christ himself would come, because he was the one that would heal people from leprosy. But it's also interesting that he's making the Samaritans obey a Jewish law. This is not what they would normally have done if they were ever healed from leprosy. But he's forcing them to obey the Jewish law in this area. Now, when we come to the widow, Jesus uses the widow and the judge to talk about a determination. As I've said before, widows were in dire straits. If they didn't have a son to fight their battles for them, they needed a man to fight their battles, to go to bat for them. So in the sense, she needed a judge to make things right. And everyone knew that. So this was not unusual. It also wasn't unusual for the judge just to ignore her. No, Jesus is using this because everyone knew she would be persistent. And so what he's saying is that is how you ought to approach God, with the same persistence that a widow would have with a judge. This story ends with Jesus using the Pharisee and the tax collector. Many ways that we can look at this, but we generally look down our nose at the Pharisee. I don't think Jesus was. I think he was preaching to them. I think he was directing this thing directly to them. Why? Because Pharisees were people who honored the Word of God, who ordered their lives in a way to keep themselves true to the Word of God. They would just go too far. I think Jesus knew that many of the Pharisees would accept him after the resurrection. The early church was made up of a lot of Pharisees. If you've been taught by Christianity very long, you have been taught by a Pharisee. The Apostle Paul was a Pharisee. The book of Galatians deals with the Judaizers, the Pharisees' teaching in the early church. And generally speaking, down through the centuries, we as Christians who honor the Word of God and order our lives to stay true to the Word of God, we become Pharisees. So Jesus is taking the time here to teach those of us who are Pharisees about the pride that is in our lives. Well, come back next week when we continue on with more insights on the story of the week. We'll see you next week.